Hello and welcome, friends. Today we have an interesting story with us, but before you start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the notifications button to get all our videos to you. At the end of December 1984, in a small village in northern India, there was a young woman named Sumitra, who at the time had her first child with her husband. This child was the most beautiful thing for her, because it was the wish she wished for in her life. She always carried this baby on her chest. Life in the village where Sumitra lived was very difficult. It was a poor village in the southern Himalayas along the Gang River. People lived in this village in mud huts. There was no electricity and no one from the village was educated. When Sumitra was young, before marriage, her mother died and her father had to travel for work. Her uncle raised her, always feeling lonely, and after she got married, her husband also had to travel to work. She lived with his father and mother, and there was no affinity between them. And when she gave birth to this child, she thought life had laughed at her. But in early 1985, all that changed. On this day, she was walking in the village and carrying her baby on her chest as she used to. She held a bowl in her hand to fill it from the well, walking down the road, suddenly stopped in place and threw the bowl from her hand on the ground. There were two residents of the village who heard the sound of the bowl being thrown on the ground, and they looked at the source of the sound and found a freezing Sumitra standing in its place. So somebody went slowly to her and asked her anxiously, but Sumitra did not answer it and remained the same. The man looked at her and found her fingers going back, and the mind of the fingers was broken and headed in the opposite direction of the joints. Before he asked to look at her face, she found the color of her eyes completely white and started pressing her teeth hard. She made a loud sound like she was grinding her teeth, afraid of the man and back. Her child kept crying a lot, which led to the gathering of a large number of villagers who were looking at her in this case. And then I looked at people and looked at her son, who was crying so hard. She kept looking at them in wonder, felt embarrassed, grabbed her baby son, carried the bowl, left them, and went to the well to fill the bowl with water. When she filled it and returned to the cottage, she did not remember anything from what happened to her. And after several weeks, the situation was repeated again, but this time it lasted longer. Her father-in-law stood near her and suddenly found her standing freezing in her place, with her fingers clenched back, her eyes white, and he moved her with his hands to return to consciousness, but she did not return. She stayed in this state for about 10 minutes until she returned to normal again, and she didn't know what had happened to her and didn't remember anything. In May 1985, Sumitra was in the same situation, but every time the situation was prolonged. Sometimes it was up to hours, and the situation began to evolve, so that she began to speak, in this case, with strange and incomprehensible words. Other times she screams and says her head breaks, and suddenly her voice drops to resemble whispering and says that what she sees is darkness. Her husband's parents attended doctors to examine her, but told them she was fine, had no medical reason for the condition, and remained so until July 16, 1985. 6 months after this situation or coma continued, she fell into another coma cooking food. But she was talking, but quietly, and she said, "I'd die in 3 days." When she returned to normal, her husband's family told her what had happened and what Kafat Sumitra had said about what they had told her. Her husband's mother had her child pregnant for fear of being hit, and her father-in-law had asked her husband to leave his job and return to sit next to her and take care of her. They were all sure she would die in 3 days, as she said. Until the day of July 19th came, she began on this day to be more eager for her life. In order not to happen to her, she avoided anything that could hurt her, and all day she sat in the cottage and went out to breathe clean air. At this time, she found her friend standing on the other side of the road and waved at her to come and sit with her to break the boredom. When her friend crossed the road, she suddenly found Sumitra froze in her place, and the color of her eyes turned white. Her fingers stiffened, and she went into a coma again. Her friend wasn't surprised by what happened to her, because she knew about her condition, and wasn't afraid because she knew she was coming back. But this time, something different happened, and Sumitra raised her hands to her head and started moving them like she was looking for something over her head that she was trying to grab. Her breathing became intense and fast, and his voice loud. Her friend was afraid of her because she had never seen her do so. Suddenly she stood and put her hands next to her, and a very low, rough sound came out. The volume was steady, but then it became deep. Her friend noticed that Sumitra had stopped breathing, and she screamed, so her husband came out and wounded, and the villagers were fully present. They gathered and summoned the doctor quickly, and when he did the examination, he told them in fear. She died, her husband heard it, and broke down tearfully. Sumitra's body remained frozen with her eyes white, and the doctor put her body on her back and closed her eyes. The religion in this village was Hindu, burning the dead body into ashes. The villagers began collecting wood to set fire to her husband's mother, and the women in the village cleaned her body. They began by placing some aromatic oils on her face, despite the village's grief that they were afraid of them. They all knew her story and were scared that they thought it was haunted in a sinister spirit, and that she did it and killed her. One of the women who was cleaning Sumitra's body was holding a hairbrush, and when she put it on her hair, she froze in place, and the fear appeared and screamed at her. She referred to Sumitra, which made women look at the place where the mirror referred. Suddenly they all screamed and ran outside the room because they saw her closed eyes moving. Her chest began to fill with air. She took out a long exhale loud, and then opened her eyes and began to do her body forward. She sat around the women in a state of great terror because they were unaware that it was happening, although 45 minutes remained dead, heart and breathing. At this time, the doctor was still there and heard the screams, so he went to see what was happening and started helping Sumitra stand. And he started examining it again, and he couldn't believe what he saw, and then looked at the women and told them, "You were now seeing a miracle." Sumitra came back to life again when her husband heard that he ran to her to embrace her. But she went back and pushed her hand forward to push him away from her, and the doctor intervened and told them to leave her for a while until she recovered. Sumitra returned to her cottage, and the next day Sumitra was in very good health, but when she saw her husband and his parents, she was very scared and fled outside the cottage. The doctor found her running outside the cottage. Her husband grabbed her by the hand, pushed him away from her, and told him how you were touching another man's wife and pulled her by force to return her to the cottage. She told him and her family, "You're not my family, and this is not my house." And the husband was pulling her hard, and the doctor was helping him, and she was screaming hard and saying, "I'm not a Sumitra." In the following days, the doctor tried to get her out of this condition, but unfortunately, all their attempts failed. Sumitra began to refuse to carry her son and tell them, "This is not my son. Bring me Rinko and Tinko." But nobody knows who you're talking about, and Sumitra was uneducated. But they found her writing letters on paper to strangers, whom she found to come and save her from. On one occasion, she found a mark on her leg and asked how it came to her leg. Sumitra refused to eat in the dishes from which the family eats. Her voice began to change, and she began to talk rudely to the family. Her family and the villagers began to get used to it, believing that she had lost her memory because of the death and return. This caused her brain damage, and it was everyone's job to prevent her from escaping from the cottage so as not to do any harm to herself. On 20th October 1985, the Sumitra family heard someone knocking on the door, and the husband went to open the door. There was a man on whom the rich appeared, standing far from the door by a distance and showing shame. He was a strange man with a big leather-wrapped book with golden edges, and the man started talking low, and her husband approached him to hear what he was saying. The man said that his name was Ram Tribas, and he was asking about a young woman who started showing strange signs of her. Sumitra's husband did not know who this man was, but what he thought about how this stranger would know his wife's story. He said he might be a clergyman who came to treat her, and the husband actually went to call his wife, but when he told her his name, she smiled hard and ran at the man, cuddled him and whispered in his ear with words that were unheard of. She looked at him angrily and told him, "My name was Shiva." There was a low wall outside the house, and he asked the husband and Sumitra to sit on that wall. When they sat, the man opened the book, and it was an album of photos, and the man pointed at a photo of someone. I asked her from this man. She answered him with confidence and told him his name and the name of everyone on this album.
The husband marveled at how she knew these people, but the photo was of a woman. But this time Sumitra did not answer quickly and began to breathe with difficulty and showed signs of anger on her face. She told Ram I knew her, my sister-in-law, and she killed me. And he signed the photo album out of the man's hand and cradled it hard. He kept crying and then asked Sumitra's husband to come home and tell him everything. The Sumitra family gathered, and the man started talking about the mirror story Shiva.
He told them that there was already a woman named Shiva who lived in a place 100 kilometers from this village. She was from a very rich and educated family with 2 young sons, but the second child was born on the same day as Sumtra's son. But after she was born to this child, she lived her worst days because her husband's parents hated her. At the time of Sumitra's coma, Shiva sent messages to her parents to save her from her husband's family. When Sumitra spoke in her coma, Shiva was at the time screaming at her husband's parents as well as them. On the night of May 18, 1985, Shiva's neighbors saw her husbands carrying her body and walking on the railway. When they asked, they told them she was sick and that they were going to the hospital to treat her. The next morning, the villagers found Shiva's body on the train road. Shiva's uncle and sister came to the scene and found her husband and his family together. But strangely, Shiva's body did not have any accident effects, as the family told them that she had met herself in front of the train. But they found a big sign on her head and said someone hit her on the head. The husband's parents then burned the body quickly so that the police would not come and expose them. When Sumitra died and returned to life again, Shiva's father heard her story. He decided to go to this girl to make sure she was his daughter. He went to them, and so when Sumitra saw him, she gave him a hard cradle, and she whispered that she told him a father. The most convincing thing was that Sumitra was Shiva, that she told him about 15 people on the album correctly, and here Ram made sure that she was a Shiva spirit embodied in Sumitra's body. This was the weirdest story of reincarnation.